Oh boy, we sure hit the weekend coming back with a lot of great discoveries. This one relates to shadow damage over time, and very specifically how it interacts with the additive damage source of just damage. What do I mean by additive damage? Well, if we look at this sword right here, you'll notice it has 270 intelligence, that's fine, essence on kill, and then plus 52% damage. Damage is a very interesting stat because it is not a niche stat, meaning it doesn't have a requirement to meet. Like if we were to look at these gloves that say damage over time, right, that only works for effects which very specifically work for damage over time. But damage typically is a lower roll, so you notice that can roll between 40 and 60, but it works for everything in the game. It works for minions, it works if you're on a rogue and using poison imbuement, it works on a druid using hurricane, plus damage just says add this to your additive damage bucket, and then do the multiplications like you normally would to calculate your damage as normal. The interesting part though is that for whatever reason, damage, the generic damage effect here, is double effective on damage over time abilities. Why? I don't know. They all just have a 2x multi as far as the addition of damage to your additive bucket. And that's kind of a lot of words to describe something that might be a little bit incoherent. So let me just go ahead and show you in real time what I mean by this. And the way that we're going to accomplish that is we're going to use basically the exact same sword. This one also has 270 intelligence. It has the same damage value because it is a two-handed sword type, and it doesn't have any other stats which will apply to the damage that we're going to do via Ebon Piercer's Blight bolts. Now, you might ask a question like, well, what about that corpse explosion damage? We're not using corpse explosion, you don't have to worry about that. What about Blight size? Blight size has nothing to do with the damage that Ebon Piercer does. And on top of that, what about the aspect that says Ultimate Shadow? That only applies to Bone Storm and Blood Wave. These two swords are completely identical as far as damage is concerned, except for, on the left there, the plus 52 damage. I currently do not have anything in my sacrifices that change my damage type. I do not currently have anything in my skill tree, which will impact the damage that we're doing. We don't have the 20% damage from Supernatural Blight. I don't have anything in the Shadow damage tree. I don't have anything at all that is going to be modifying that damage. And on top of that, I completely respect my Paragon to remove all points. So the only things that are currently affecting our character right now, let me just take off this sword, are our base stats, shadow damage over time, which is inherent on the piece of gear Ebon Piercer itself, and then I'm going to show you the difference between using this weapon and this weapon, where the only addition will be this all damage stat here. Now, the cool part about Ebon Piercer and the bolts that shoot out of it is that its damage has no range at all. There isn't a 20% range based off of using a skill. It is a flat damage source, meaning that it is not impacted by the skill that we're using. It just needs to be triggered like it normally would. So I'm going to shoot Blight out, and I'm going to hit this target with just the bolt itself. I hit it with one bolt, and you'll see it's doing 2,072 damage per tick. Now, just very quickly, because people always ask this question, how come sometimes you see a different damage number at the beginning and at the end? The damage over time is applied twice per second, and if it's applied too late into a second, you're going to get a truncated version of that amount of damage. So if there was only like 30% of a second left, you're going to do 30% of that tick. Well, it would actually be 15% of that tick damage because it's twice per second. But that's why at the beginning and at the end of a damage over time effect, you will see different numbers than the damage numbers in the middle. So just always keep that in mind. Also, when you're doing your own testing, don't be led astray by those weird little truncated damage amounts. But again, let's go ahead and do this damage here. So I'm going to do it again. You notice that we're doing 2,072 damage, and we're going to do it one more time. And you'll notice that we're doing 2,072 damage. My current gear with just this weapon equipped with no additive damage, and then currently Ebon Piercer, will always do 2,072 damage every single time that I cast. Okay, great. We're going to use that as our baseline. So I just listed that here very quickly. The damage that we're currently doing without any additive damage on our weapon at all is 2,072. Now, that's not our true damage number though, because remember again, Ebon Piercer actually has a small bit of additive damage on it. So Ebon Piercer currently has 24.8 additive damage. We have no other additive damage, so this is the only value in any bucket, the one additive damage bucket that we have. So to get how much our true damage is with this effect, we would need to take this number and divide it by 1.25. 1.248. Now, the reason why we divide this by 1.248 would be very clear to people if you have watched my here's how you calculate damage overview video. I guess I'll go ahead and link that right here above in case you haven't seen it. I would highly recommend watching it. But basically, we have no other multipliers. We don't have any other special effects. We're not doing anything weird. All we're doing is relying on our additive damage bucket. And to be able to calculate how much damage you get from that, you take 1 plus your total amount of additive. So if I had 500 additive, it would be 1 plus 500 divided by 100 to get it down to an integer. So I would multiply my damage by 6. In this case, I only have 24.8. I divide that by 100. I add that to 1. So I'm currently getting a 1.248 damage multiplier. So our true damage for this effect, if there was no additive damage on Ebon Piercer, would be 1600 damage, roughly 1660. It's going to be important to know that damage number in a quick second. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to swap over to my exact same sword with the exact same stats, except this one has 52 additive damage. And if this worked the way that it should work, which is just add 52 damage to our bucket, I can go ahead and show you what our expected damage number would be. So if there was no weird bug thing going on right here, what we would expect our damage to be, just by adding 52 additive damage, we would take our base number here and we would multiply this by 1 plus our total additive damage. So let me go ahead and put this into double. So it'd be this number, the 24.8 plus 52. You would divide that by 100, go ahead and throw on 2 more parentheses, and we should expect to get 2,935 damage, because that's what happens when you take 1,600 damage and multiply it by 1 plus a total of 76.8. So it'd be 1.768 damage, just to show you it in long form there, in case you wanted to see it. That's our expected damage number. Let's go ahead and cast Blight and see what happens here then. So I have my sword on, I have 52 additive damage, no other stats which impact my damage at all. And I go ahead and I cast Blight, which has no variance, and we're doing 3,799 damage. 3,799. That's how much damage we're actually doing. So if we look at like our true damage change here, right, from the 3,799 from the base damage number, like how much we're expecting to have gotten out of all of this. Instead, we take this and we divide it by this to look at what our total change in damage was. And this number is 2.28 times as strong as this number. Now, how do we possibly get up to that amount? Well, if I take this equation, and what if I were to say I would just add on another 52, because I'm telling you that it's double effective. The number that we would get to is 3,798.66. Rounding up, that's 3,799. So the only way for this all to happen is if the stat damage is twice effective on damage over time abilities. This works on Shadow Bloodwave when you use Ultimate Shadow. This works on Corpse Explosion. This works on Decompose. This works on Blight. It works on any damage over time ability. Now, what does that mean for optimizing your build to do as much damage as possible? Well, first we have to ask the question, is double damage, that generic damage roll right there, stronger than any of the other damage rolls that you could get on a piece of gear? And the math is actually quite simple. When considering damage over time, the roll that damage can get on this weapon, for example, is 40 to 60. Since it's double effective, it's like getting a roll between 80 and 120. Now let's go ahead and look at the enchanter, as well as tempering options at the blacksmith, to figure out if this outperforms any of our other damage rolls that are available. For offensive, the values start to get pretty interesting. So let's start with just looking at Shadow Finesse, right? Let's say we're using Blight. So Blight is a darkness skill. Blight likes shadow damage over time. So when we look at these options, we can either get a roll of basically 42 to 55 for darkness skill damage. Now, that's not super high because it's not a very niche option. It's if it is a darkness skill, do more damage. But we can look at shadow damage over time. Shadow damage over time says 57 to 75. Okay, great. Let's look at the natural finesse board and figure out how much damage the generic damage would add. So if it's 31.5 to 45, that is 63 to 90. So 63 to 90, again, remember you have to think about it as 2x the value for dots. 63 to 90 or 57 to 75. Well, here, tempering on damage as opposed to damage over time would be strictly better. Now, if you happen to get damage to crowd control enemies, This will work the moment that you put on something like Decrepify, so it's not that hard to get it. And also, if you were to look at something like damage to close, you could just be close to the targets all that you want. But if we were to compare damage versus damage to close, it is 63 to 90 as opposed to 62.5 to 85. So here, if I was making a Blight build, a Necromancer Blight build or Blighted Corpse Explosion, I would want to roll damage over any of the options here, except for Corpse Explosion, right? I just said for a Corpse Explosion build. This Corpse Explosion roll is 72.5 to 95. That outperforms our 63 to 90. So now, when you're putting together your build, you have to ask the question, how important is each one of these stats to me? But on a Blight build, strictly better to go for damage here. With the outcome of damage to crowd control is still very good for the build, and damage to close is even better for the build than damage to crowd controlled because we're close to them all the time. The only dead roll that you would get on this temper would be damage to distant, but now let's look at a weapon. And here's where it gets very interesting, and you're probably gonna be like, oh, well, that kind of sick. No, stick with me here. When we're looking at a weapon, the damage roll on it is 40 to 60, meaning that it's 80 to 120. Again, think about it as 2x. So 80 to 120 is strictly worse than 100 to 120. While they can still get to the same max damage, the min damage roll on damage over time will always outperform the damage roll because it's 100 versus 80. Simple, close-cut case. Except that damage and niche damages actually aren't in the same bracket of stats, meaning you can get both of them on a sword or a weapon of your choice at the same time. Here, with my sword that already has intelligence, already has damage, I could re-roll for damage over time, meaning I could have 120 damage over time and double the effectiveness of normal damage. I could also have 120 damage. So I could just have 240 damage of additive damage on my weapon before I add on masterworking and increase these values even further, and that's without rolling a greater affix on it as well. Because you could actually have a greater affix damage over time and a greater affix damage roll along with intelligence, and weapons start to get pretty wild for how much damage you can add on to them for dot builds. Now, the last little thing that I just wanted to toss in here, because I realized it a little bit late into the recording, is that also when we're talking about a two-handed weapon, the addition of a temper to it is actually twice effective, right? So the roll for a plain damage roll on a two-handed weapon would be 63 to 90. So an additional 90 additive damage, which would then be doubled to 180 for damage over time. So you could have your weapon that has 60 additive damage plus 120 damage over time. And again, the damage is doubled, so that's 240 damage. And then temper on another 90 additive damage, which would actually be doubled to 180. And what you end up with is 420 additive damage on just your sword, just from the tempers and base stat rolls without greater affixes and without masterworking. That's kind of insane. Now, what you need to look out for is the fact that I'm going to go put together my Blight build again. I'm probably going to try it out without using Corpse Explosion. I've been talking to people like Sirach, another fantastic guide creator, saying like basically, hey, we just gave up on the concept of Black River and Corpse Explosion. We're just going full in on Blight. Have you seen this? And obviously I had to sit down and kind of test it out a bit more and think about how to optimize it even further. So I'm sending my findings off to them as well. But we're going to go see what kind of ridiculous amounts of damage you can trigger on a pure Blight build, abusing all of the ridiculous amounts of additive damage you can basically put on the build for free. So look forward to an even further optimized endgame build for the Blight Necromancer. I'm currently running tier 97 without fully masterworked gear, without perfect affixes, and without using any of this tech at all. So I'm gonna go basically recreate a full set of gear, get it all masterwork back up, and see how high into the hundreds I can push, all without using the Elixir of Holy Bolts. So I'm excited to be able to bring that to you. If you're brand new to the channel, you've been enjoying the content, go ahead and hit subscribe. Also, a lot of people, I've been in your algorithm now for a while, and a lot of people aren't subscribed who think that they are. So go ahead and check that button, it means the world to me. If you could also throw a like onto the video, I would super appreciate it. And if you had any questions, comments, concerns, interesting interactions, things that you wanted to test, or weird stuff you've seen in the game that nobody has touched on yet, let me know down there. Come join the Discord, come talk to all the giant necro nerds who hang out there just trying to share information. I'd love to have you. But as always, thank you so much for watching this video. I truly hope that it helps you out. And as always, I look forward to seeing you in the next one.